Chosen one, if this message reached you today, it's because something deep inside answered the call before you even clicked, pulling you away from the noise to this moment. You didn't arrive here by accident. You were summoned to remember what they made you forget. This video will show how they turned your purity into a crime and why the truth you carry is the undoing of their mask. What if I told you they built your guilt to hide their own decay? And every twist of your story was their attempt to stay safe while the real fault lines cracked beneath them. You felt the isolation, the whispers, the subtle reshaping of your reality to fit a story that makes the powerful comfortable and the real ones dangerous. That's not your failure. That's the result of a system trying to camouflage its rot by framing your light as a threat. This is the moment the false narrative that has hunted you is exposed, and the balance they broke by attacking what was sacred begins to shift. If this message already speaks to your soul, subscribe, like this video, and comment 77 below. Stay with this until the end, because what's coming next is not just awareness. It's your reminder that they miscalculated. Your presence was always the shift, and the truth they tried to bury is rising now. Number 1. Why your goodness became a threat. They turned your clarity into suspicion, your boundaries into accusations, and your quiet consistency into a story that makes others feel less fragile. The reason your goodness became a threat is simple. Your light reflected back their hidden decay, and when the mirror shows what they refuse to face, they will rewrite the reflection to protect themselves. They built a narrative that painted your honesty as aggression, your sensitivity as weakness that needed correction, and your refusal to play their game as rebellion. In that story, you become the villain so they don't have to look in the broken places they've hidden beneath their titles, approvals, or alliances. The psychology at play was designed to isolate you, to make you question your own instincts while granting them the authority to define your truth. Yet there is a deeper layer. This was not just social survival, it was spiritual avoidance. When a soul aligned with purpose shows up, it destabilizes the staged piece built on compromise, lies, and silent bargains. Look to Habakkuk 2 verse 3, where it says that vision waits its appointed time and will not lie. The delay you felt was not abandonment, it was the preparation of your vindication. Their story used your purity as a threat because they knew deep down that what you carry exposes false foundations. Comment truth if you remember the moment they tried to rewrite you. The mask they wore is cracking, and in the next part you'll see what happens when they go even further, attacking what was anointed, believing they could silence the source. There was a moment, perhaps in a dream that flickered like a half-remembered film, where you saw yourself standing in a quiet room while voices outside tried to rewrite what you were doing there. Maybe it wasn't a dream at all. Maybe it was an inner image where you felt the weight of a story being placed on your shoulders that didn't belong to you. That soft, persistent whisper inside. The one you learned to doubt because the world told you you were too sensitive, too intense, too different, is now a bridge. What you've always felt, the way your kindness was questioned, the way your peace triggered a defensive ripple in others, is not a flaw. It's a signal. The story you've lived so far, full of confusion, mislabeling, and quiet erasure, is beginning to open like a door that reveals a corridor of purpose. This is the first quiet confirmation. Your life was not a series of random misalignments. There's a pattern, and it carries intention. The veil between what was internalized as wrong and what was always true is thinning, and the space you've been given here is the invitation to step into that recognition without needing to explain it to those who never asked what it cost you to stay silent. You've spent years feeling the mismatch between who you are and what others expected, trying to adjust, soften, or justify in order to keep the peace. You remember too well the times your plain truth was reframed as too much. The boundaries you set were turned into evidence of control, and your emotional clarity was turned into suspicion. You've walked rooms where the energy shifted when you entered, not because you did anything loud, but because your presence reflected something in others they'd hidden. There were moments when you held your tongue to avoid being labeled, and later watched the same people repeat the very distortions they'd imposed on you as if they were gospel. You felt isolated because the collective story around you needed your silence to maintain its false balance. In private, you questioned whether you were the problem. Outwardly, you carried their projections with the weight of apology, while internally you kept a small, stubborn ember of knowing. Something didn't add up, and it kept whispering that the real misalignment was not in you, but in the story they forced onto you. What you've been experiencing is not random emotional fallout or lack of spiritual strength. There has always been an unseen architecture beneath your path, an arrangement of events, rejections, subtle awakenings, and forced retreats designed not to break you, but to prepare you to see clearly. The psychological mechanisms they used to villainize your clarity were themselves a response to a deeper spiritual tension. Your integrity exposed their instability. This is not mere social defense. It is spiritual avoidance. When someone walks in resonance with divine timing and refuses to compromise, it disturbs the fabricated peace others built to hide their own rot. That disturbance needed a narrative, so they built one. They turned your light into threat, your discipline into rigidity, and your refusal to conform into rebellion. You were made to carry guilt for being the beacon that made their shadows visible. Yet the true story is written in a language older than their justifications. In Zechariah 3 verses 1-2, when the accuser stood ready to condemn, the voice that mattered corrected the record, not by loud rebuttal, but by revealing the deeper identity beneath the accusation. Your life has similar correction coming. The mislabeling was never the end of the sentence. It was the prelude to being recognized for what you always were. Small things have been showing up, and you might have dismissed them as coincidence or wishful thinking. A phrase in a conversation that froze time with its relevance. The recurring number or symbol that appears just when you need the reminder. The sudden clarity after a period of confusion, as if something inside rearranged itself overnight. These aren't random glitches. They are gentle pulses of alignment, breadcrumbs placed not to confuse, but to guide. Maybe you felt déjà vu so strong it shook you, like the soul whispering, "Remember." Maybe a dream that felt layered with meaning returned with a detail that mirrors your current struggle, and you woke up with a subtle shift in perception, as if a locked piece of the puzzle clicked. The physical sensations, pressure behind the eyes, sudden chills when you speak certain truths, the way silence became louder around the lies, are all part of the same thread. These signs are quiet confirmations of a deeper opening. They are the universe's soft punctuation, saying this is real, you are on the thread, and the story that turned your purity into a threat is being peeled back to expose the foundation it hid. You've been told that your intuition is unreliable, that your inner knowing is exaggerated, that the times you felt pulled somewhere without logic were imagination. That was a protective smokescreen placed over your truth so the world could keep its comfortable story. But now something shifts, and the internal compass you thought was broken begins to realign with a calm precision. It's not sudden fireworks. It's a slow, warm settling, a recognition that you have been navigating with a map written in your spirit all along. You begin to see patterns in your own reactions, and they no longer feel like mistakes but like coded messages you were meant to decode. The internal tension that once created anxiety now becomes a calibration point. There is a quiet assurance that if you pause and listen, the answers are already there. The misdirection from others loses its power because you feel the difference between their imposed stories and your inner truth. Isaiah 54 verse 17 whispered across time, "No weapon formed against you will prosper, and the accusations thrown to redefine you are not the final words. They are the signs that what's real is about to outlast them." Your intuition, previously shamed into silence, is now a quiet anchor that says you were never wrong to trust the pull. As that inner anchoring deepens, you realize this awakening isn't about creating something new inside of you. It's about recovering what was buried beneath layers of noise, compromise, and altered identity. You are not becoming a stranger to yourself. You are remembering the original echo. There is a core that was always intact, a spiritual signature that required the pressure of misinterpretation to sharpen it, and the false narratives to separate it from distraction. The shape of your identity has been there like a riverbed beneath silt. The work now is the gentle clearing, not to invent, but to allow the original current to flow again. Reflections from Psalm 139 begin to settle. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. What was once anxiety about your difference now reads as evidence of a heart being searched and refined, not broken. That memory, that archetypal knowing, is an inheritance, not a condition. The realization that you were marked, not for rejection, but for purpose, is the quiet revolution that begins to rewrite your inner script. Recovery feels like reconnection, a return to a frequency that hums beneath the chaos of all the reframed stories you've carried. Now, begin to claim the first activation of that remembering. The sensitivity you once hid is the radar that detects the falseness others are comfortable living in. The hunger for deeper meaning, which they labeled as unrest or neediness, is actually your soul's alignment GPS pulling you back to your true course. Those moments when you've paused and said nothing, knowing the truth, and watched the layers peel away without uttering a word. Those were acts of power, quiet and sovereign. You do not need to perform to be seen. You only need to be aware. Let the reality of your inner wisdom settle like a seed waking, not because you forced it, but because the soil is ripe. Remember the way your clarity unsettled anxious people, not because you attacked them, but because the integrity of your presence reflected what they had built on compromise. That reflection is not your burden to fix. It is the catalyst they feared because it shows them what they've hidden. Step forward with the understanding that your goodness, your consistency, your faithful holding of truth is not vulnerability, it's activation. The power isn't loud. It's the steady emergence of someone who no longer allows their essence to be contorted for others' comfort. Your arrival to this message was never a random click. It was a convergence of the signs, the inner nudges, the soul memory, and the times you felt misread, all aligning so that a truth could land in a place where you could hear it and begin to act from it. You've been carrying their version of your story long enough, and now the mirror they polished to distort you is cracking because the pattern behind your life is shifting into clarity. Comment seen if you recognize that what you endured was never just pain but initiation, and if you feel the beginning of the shift where your presence no longer needs their permission to hold power. Keep watching, because what comes next uncovers what happens when they go beyond rewriting your story and try to silence what was anointed, believing they could drown the source, not knowing their own undoing has already been written. And if you feel called to go even deeper, there's a sacred space reserved for our community, a private room where you receive full prophetic messages daily. Join our private membership through the link in the description and walk this path with us. Please accept our special thanks to current members who have held this light and helped it grow. Their presence has kept the signal clear and the truth amplified. Number 2, when they attack what's anointed, they believe that by shaming you, undermining your integrity, and staging your fall, they could erase the divine assignment you carry. What they failed to understand is that harming someone marked by purpose isn't just social sabotage, it is spiritual treason. There is a balance beyond what human courts see, a deeper ledger where intention, betrayal, and hidden motives are known and weighed. When they struck at you, they violated sacred order, and that violation doesn't disappear because they cloaked it in gossip, rumors, or staged concern. The consequences begin to show not always as drama in their lives, but as the unraveling of their unseen safety nets, the exposure of what they built on borrowed power, and the internal collapse that starts when truth refuses to stay buried. Micah 7 verse 8 reminds them, though they celebrated your stumble, they are premature in their rejoicing because you rise again, stronger, and their temporary triumph becomes the evidence of their own decay. The attack was meant to silence you, but it triggered a counterforce. Justice in a form they didn't expect, one that doesn't need spectacle because it moves quietly beneath the surface and reorders things from the roots. Comment treason if you felt the unseen weight shift after they tried to break you. Their scheme is bruised, and the next layer shows how they recruited others to cover their tracks, making silence look like agreement. The first shift arrived like a quiet pressure behind the eyes, a heaviness that had no name but carried the scent of something working against you. It wasn't loud. It was the way conversations veered when you spoke truth, the sudden chill in rooms where you were present, the inexplicable delays and obstacles that appeared just as you were about to move forward. At first it felt like bad timing, coincidence, or internal doubt, until you noticed the pattern. The more aligned you became, the more the resistance sharpened. That subtle interference wasn't random static. It was a boundary being tested, a field pushing back because something in you was recalibrating the noise around it. You didn't see the design then. You only felt the friction, as if unseen hands were trying to smooth you into a shape that wouldn't disturb the old order. It's the same silence that once made prophets feel exile in plain sight, the wilderness pressure before the breakthrough, the quiet days before a storm of revelation. In that murky space, the veil thinned enough for you to sense that their opposition had purpose, because they weren't struggling with ordinary people. They were pushing against someone carrying more than a personality or opinion. They were reacting to an assignment, a resonance they could not name and therefore feared. That pressure landed inside you like a bruise that didn't show on the surface but hurt with every breath. You learned to live with the internal soundtrack of being too intense, too sensitive, too unwavering, and the messages came dressed as criticism from people who should have seen you differently. You received the sideways glances when you set boundaries, the quiet distancing after you spoke up, the stories whispered that reinterpreted your attempts at alignment into faults needing correction. Shame arrived dressed as correction. Rejection came wrapped in concern. You began to carry the weight of "something is wrong with me," while the real wrong was their discomfort with what you reflected back to them. The emotional fatigue didn't come from you being broken. It came from constantly recalibrating to protect a gift that was being gaslit into silence. Self-doubt became a coat you wore to hide from the hunting glare of those who wanted the shape of your calling reshaped to fit their comfort. You felt isolated, not because you were alone in essence, but because the collective mirror kept warping your reflection while telling you the distortion was real. That internal crumbling nearly broke your trust in your own heart, and for a while you wondered if the resistance was a sign that you should stop trying to be light at all. Then, when the fog lifted for a moment, it became clear that the pressure was not an accident of personality clashes. It was structural. Something deeper than personal preference was being defended. The forces lining up against you were not merely offended. They were responding to exposure. What they attacked wasn't a flaw. It was what held the potential to burn through the cover they draped over decay. This was a spiritual battlefield dressed in the clothes of social conflict, and the wounds were the kind that carry ancient echoes. Remember the exile of the Israelites in Babylon, where the comfortable narratives of the captors tried to rewrite identity and assign blame for displacement, while the divine promise remained intact beneath the dust. That same sacred tension exists here. Your experience of being undermined, misrepresented, and shamed was a trial, yes, but a refining one. You stood in a space where sacred order was being trespassed. Your assignment made their concealment visible, and they reacted to protect what they had built on borrowed authority. The ancient metaphor of the wilderness emerges not as punishment but as preparation. Pressure occurred because your purpose was too bright to be allowed to pass unnoticed, and the trial was a way to force the hidden into the open, making its defense show itself. Looking back now, the patterns reveal themselves like light turned on in a dark room. The sudden ally that pulled away without explanation, the project that stalled when it should have flown, the people who seemed supportive but built soft walls around you that kept you contained. These were not isolated disappointments. They were deliberate diversions and layered obstructions meant to slow your unfolding or to cloak the real conflict so you doubted your own timeline. There were moments you were offered help that subtly redirected your energy into safe conformity, the familiar faces that turned quiet at the crucial moment, and the strategic confusion placed in your path just as you started hearing the deeper voice. You might have chalked it up to bad luck or poor timing, but now you see the choreography. Each betrayal, each draining environment, each story spun about you had a hidden aim, not to destroy but to divert, not to silence you completely, but to confuse the origin of the pressure so that you'd question whether your purpose was worth the cost. That coincidence now reads like a pattern of guardrails being thrown up around a truth that refused to be hidden, and the density of the resistance itself begins to serve as a map to your own depth. As the weight of all this became clearer, you could no longer pretend it was only about people or situations. The resistance had texture, a spiritual thickness to it. There were times when your clarity met with a heavy air, as if the very space around your words grew fogged. Conversations were cut short, doors that once opened easily creaked closed without explanation, and a sense of being watched by silence settled like a low mist. This was not paranoia. It was spiritual interference manifesting in the world. The light you carried attracted distortion, not because you were flawed, but because your frequency exposed the static others were comfortable with. The silent watchers are those energies or narratives that sit just beyond perception, waiting to block the channel before the truth courses through. The sabotage wasn't always active aggression. It operated through subtle dampening, misinformation, delayed responses, distracted allies, emotional fog. It felt like swimming with weights while the others who built their life around illusion floated free. Out of this came the heavy realization that your spiritual ascent had a shadow counterpart. Forces aligned to keep you muted, to change your reflection, to convince you that your sensitivity was the window they could break instead of addressing their own cracked foundations. Somewhere in the middle of that struggle, your reaction became the quiet battleground of its own. You adapted. You softened words to avoid backlash. You recalled instances where you dimmed your own light just to not be the story they could frame as disruptive. Maybe you started over-explaining your motives, trying to make your integrity acceptable to the damaged structures around you. Or perhaps you rebelled quietly, carrying the hurt like a secret flame that burned under the guise of compliance while you waited for a safe moment to speak. There was the temptation to fold into the narrative they wrote for you, to believe that the resistance meant you were too volatile to keep standing. Some days you felt like surrendering the clarity that made others uncomfortable, just to breathe easier. But even in the dimming, you held pieces of your truth that wouldn't vanish, a hidden archive of knowing that silently refused the rewrite. That internal mirror reflecting confusion and purpose was a space of grief, yes, but also the early draft of reclamation, because the way you responded to pressure has always contained the seeds of your return to strength. The resistance that once terrified now serves as proof. This is the pivot where condemnation flips into confirmation. The attacks, the shaming, the undermining, and the silent concern were not signs that you were off course. They were acknowledgments that you were on a path that mattered. They struck because you were anointed. They tried to erase what they couldn't define because undefined power frightened their constructed order. What they aimed at to silence became the very ground from which your voice returns. Here is what is being given back to you: the right to name what was done, the right to redefine the narrative, the right to use the pressure they placed as fuel. You don't need their permission to hold your calling or to step into what was marked in you. The spiritual treason they committed, attacking someone under divine assignment, opened a ledger, and the balance has already begun to shift. The truth is not reactive. It is regenerative. Your response now is not fight in the old sense. It is standing with recalibrated sight, using their opposition as a compass that shows where your impact is deepest and where the old structures crumble most easily. The voice coming back is firmer, not louder, and it belongs to the self they tried to silence. You were opposed because you are powerful, and the more they tried to block your passage, the more your purpose sharpened in clarity. Their temporary celebrations became the markers of their own premature victory, as foretold in Micah 7 verse 8. And your resurgence is the evidence that their judgment was shallow, their control brittle. The same pressure that bent you almost broke now bends the system. A subtle tidal shift that begins beneath their noise and moves outward. Comment treason if you've felt the weight shift after their attempt to erase you, if you've sensed the turning point where opposition stopped being a cage and became a declaration that the source they tried to kill is rising without their permission. Stay tuned, because the next revelation pulls back the curtain on how they recruited silence to cover their tracks, turning bystanders into accomplices and making their collective doubt the shell that once held your truth captive. And to every soul who's supported with a super thanks, thank you. You are keeping this light alive for others who haven't found it yet. If you feel called to help this mission reach more chosen ones, tap the super thanks button below. Your energy supports these messages and helps them travel further. Your voice matters, and your light is felt here. Number 3, how silence became complicity. They didn't just attack you outright. They built a silent court, recruited quiet witnesses, and turned neutrality into a weapon. The real power of their gaslighting came when they made the absence of your defenders feel like guilt, when whispers shaped consensus, and when the people who could have spoken up chose safety over truth. They flipped reality, painted hesitation as doubt, and used the fear of being seen as breaking the unspoken rules to keep others from standing beside you. The networked pressure wasn't accidental. It was tactical. They pressed on the edges of your story, making small shifts in perception that accumulated into a broader narrative where you appeared unstable while their foundation stayed hidden. Jeremiah 17 verse 10 is the reminder that the divine sees beyond the public smoke. What they curated on the surface was a distraction, and the internal motives they hid in plain sight are now coming to light because the origin of the silence was not neutrality. It was protection of the corrupt. Your consistent presence, refusal to back down, and quiet integrity exposed their engineering of doubt. Comment silence if you've experienced this and add a personal reflection. Share a dream, memory, challenge, or knowing that showed you the moment the crowd turned away or the moment you realized their consensus was built on fear. That shared truth shifts the weight and foreshadows what comes next. The quiet force that doesn't need to fight to bring down their systems. A shift quietly happened, like the moment dawn light slips through a crack and suddenly the room you've been stumbling in is no longer just shadow and confusion. Something that felt like a glitch in the story. Those empty chairs when you needed allies, the sudden coldness from familiar faces, the echo of silence after you spoke truth, begins to resolve into a pattern. What was once vague and painful now feels like a veil being lifted just enough for you to glimpse the mechanism beneath. The absence around you wasn't empty. It was a structure being held in place by collective agreement, and you were the one who, by simply being yourself, started to unravel that agreement. The quiet court wasn't by accident. It was devised, piece by piece, by those who understood that if your light burned steadily without fanfare, their shadows would become visible. That realization lands with a weight that is unsettled but clarifying. What you accepted as loneliness was often complicity dressed in neutral tones, and their silence wasn't benign. It was a defense system built to make your integrity look like instability. The emotional texture of watching people look away when the truth needed a voice is a specific kind of soreness. It builds like a low-grade ache that lives in your spine, making every attempt to lean into trust also feel like walking on glass. You've likely felt the confusion of hearing supportive words while seeing their actions withdraw. The whispered, "It's complicated," that covered their choice to not intervene, and the narrative they layered around your discomfort to soften their absence. That pressure, internalized, becomes a silent accusation. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe I pushed too hard. Maybe my truth isn't worth defending. Shame wrapped itself around your instinct to call things what they were, and concern was used as camouflage for omission. You felt exposed, not because you lacked strength, but because the world made neutrality feel like safety while making your clarity look like imbalance. That emotional erosion wasn't a failure of character. It was the cost of carrying light in a space that needed dark stories to stay intact. The isolation didn't come from being different. It came from the active decision of others to stay quiet while the machinery that painted you unstable kept turning. When you begin to look deeper, it becomes clear that the quietness around you was not a vacuum. It was a layered, protective framework built to shelter something else. The structures that kept your truth contained had a logic. They were rooted in fear of exposure, in the desire to maintain appearances, and in the leverage that silence gives to the guilty. They reacted because your presence started the slow unraveling of equilibrium they depended on. That is the sacred paradox. The very systems that opposed you did so because they felt the weight of your alignment. In ancient times, prophets were often isolated not because they were unfit, but because the existing order feared the destabilizing nature of a voice aligned with a higher justice. The wilderness, as described in the journeys of Israel, was not simply a place of abandonment but a purifying space where external consensus could fall away so the internal decree could be heard. This pressure you faced was part of a field where false foundations were being exposed by your existence, and the reaction, silence from allies, distortion from observers, was their attempt to reassert control, to dampen the emerging frequency that promised reform. Their quiet was strategic. It was not neutrality but armor worn to avoid the light you reflected back on their own cracks. Now, if you step back and view your path through new eyes, the hidden choreography becomes visible. Look at the repeated delays right before critical breakthroughs, the people who appeared just to stall your momentum, the seemingly small compromises you were nudged into that shifted your energy away from what was essential. Those coincidences were not random interruptions. They were defensive moves in a larger game of narrative containment. The whispered consensus that painted your reactions as overreactions, the reframing of your patience as passivity, the quiet removal of support when you needed it most, these were part of a pattern of engineered doubt designed to make you question the source of the interference, not exposing the corruptors themselves. You may have thought you were simply unlucky, too emotional, or too sensitive to be taken seriously, yet the truth now holds a sharper form. You were being edged, nudged, and rerouted to make your integrity look like instability, while the real instability lived in those who refused to speak. That clarity is both unsettling and freeing, because it shows that the energy spent adjusting to their silence could now be reversed, not toward accommodation, but toward reclaiming the narrative they attempted to control. The pressure evolved into something you could feel, like a dense fog pressing on your chest, making every step forward require a deliberate call to your own center. This was not passive resistance. It was energetic interference, a spiritual dampening using systems, spoken and unspoken, to slow your frequency. Doors that should have opened wide closed with a gentle lethargy. Conversations that might have sparked movement petered out with a mystifying neutrality. There were moments you felt watched, not by obvious eyes, but by currents that moved around your truth, as if your light triggered a hush in the room, like someone drawing the blinds without anyone admitting they did. Your inner compass began to pulse harder in those moments, the subtle signals growing louder because your original direction was being obscured. That interference had a shape. It was the fog of collective doubt, the stillness of voices that could have stood and instead chose to watch, the kind of editing that made you second-guess the clarity you once owned. Spiritually, this is when you begin to perceive that your light attracted distortion not as punishment, but as proof of its potency. The more you aligned, the more their mechanisms reacted, and the more you sharpened under the pressure of their quiet opposition. In response to all this, something in you bent toward accommodation, then recoiled, then hesitated over and over. You learned the subtle dance of hiding depth so it wouldn't be turned into a weapon, of giving partial truth to reduce the backlash, of putting a softer face on conviction so it wouldn't bruise tender egos. Sometimes you withdrew entirely, preferring invisibility over being misread. And in that withdrawal, you lost pieces of your voice that were never meant to be silent. Other times you pushed through the noise with the quiet fatigue of someone who knows the cost and keeps going anyway, ironing your own edges so the system would accept just enough of you to feel safe while it kept the rest muted. That internal tension, between the need to speak and the fear of making their silence louder, created a reflective space where your reaction was carrying both grief and preparation. It was a mirror showing how deeply you adapted, and in that adaptation, the seeds of reclamation were being sown, because your response was never proof that you were wrong. It was proof that you cared enough about the truth to survive the containment they built. Now the meaning of the resistance becomes something else entirely, a confirmation of assignment. They didn't try to silence you because you were insignificant. They mobilized structures, folded in neutrality, and engaged in slow erasure because your presence threatened their constructed reality. Their efforts to turn your stability into instability, to make your faithfulness look like stubbornness, and to make your watching silence seem like consent were the marks of someone who understood that beneath the surface, something was awakening that could not be controlled by their usual plays. This is when you get the voice back, soft at first, then sure, says, "I see what was done. I own what was mine all along. I don't need to justify my clarity to people who built a court of silence to avoid the truth." The spiritual treason they committed, attacking what was anointed and making their complicit quiet a weapon, has already opened up the ledger of reckoning, and the balance is shifting through the subtle unmasking of the structures that protected their narratives. This reclamation is not loud retaliation. It's the steady realignment of your story with the original frequency that drew the opposition in the first place, and the energy that once made you doubt becomes the foundation you now use to stand firm. You were opposed because you are not small, and the system that tried to contain you was only a temporary frame around a growing light. The more they layered silence over your truth, the more your presence radiated a clarity they could not own, and the more that clarity demanded recognition. Their quiet was the echo of their fear. Your rising voice is the prophecy of what was always coming. Comment silence if you recognize the moment when the quiet around you shifted and you realized their absence was engineered, and add a personal reflection. Share a dream, memory, challenge, or inner knowing that first made you see the pattern, the moment the court of quiet stopped feeling normal and started feeling like a signal. Keep watching, because what comes next reveals how truth itself, simply by showing up consistently, begins to destabilize the very systems that tried to rewrite you, without a fight, without a performance, just by being present. Number 4. The quiet force that breaks systems. You didn't have to shout to destabilize their structure. Your presence, steady and real, acted like a slow current under a brittle surface. Systems built on lies recoil not from loud warfare, but from the silent truth that refuses to adapt or apologize. The moment you held your ground, kept your integrity, and continued to walk aligned, the false hierarchies began to shift because their stability depended on the assumption that you would conform, soften, or disappear. Instead, you stayed, and that quiet resistance created cracks. Hosea 6 verse 3 points to the pursuit of knowing deeper, and while they chase drama and surface narrative, your commitment to alignment created a ripple that undermines their theater. Their reliance on performance and projection could not match the depth of what you carried. Truth as a presence does not compete. It reveals. The real threat to them was never that you spoke. It was that you existed in your full form without needing their approval. Comment presence if you feel that steady force in yourself and include a personal reflection. Share how you've seen your quiet consistency shift situations, expose falseness, or draw others toward clarity. Their masks are slipping, and the next moment is the expansion, where everything begins to unify and move with the knowledge that the tide has turned. They are watching the moment you stop waiting and begin choosing. There is a threshold where the silence that once felt like pressure turns into a mirror asking, will you continue to soften for their comfort, or will you stand as the truth that unsettles their false calm? That moment is not dramatic fireworks. It's a quiet internal shift where passivity becomes unbearable. You have lived long enough under their assumption that you could be shaped, dulled, and negotiated with, and now the inner question arrives with weight. Will you keep folding your presence to fit the cracks in their collapsing system, or will you allow your steady force to move through it, not with noise but with clarity? The crossroads is sacred because it asks you to reconcile what you've absorbed, every apology you offered for existing, every retreat from your own edges, with the reality that those concessions were not humility. They were survival tactics in a structure that feared the very thing you carry. The choice now is not between loud rebellion and quiet resignation. It is between continuing to live in their softened story or stepping fully into the unedited current you were built to become. This is the point where waiting becomes abdication and action becomes alignment. Everything you ceded, the hours you spent shrinking yourself, the emotional bandwidth given to explain and justify, the voice muted to avoid making others uncomfortable, was training ground, not defeat. This was a season where power was cataloged in silence, where the quiet endurance of your presence accumulated like unseen capital. Now you are called to retrieve it. Call back the time you invested in pleading, the energy spent editing your truth for acceptance, the parts of you that were set aside so the noise around you wouldn't flare. Speak them into your field with ritual precision. Reclaim your voice, reclaim your stillness, reclaim the authority you let others define for you. This is not permission-seeking language. It is decree. You do not ask to sit at the table. They built their tables on shifting sand while you were forged on something deeper. Lift up the fragments of your internal throne. Dust them with the knowledge that their systems only appeared stable because you deferred, and now bring them together in the center of your own sovereignty. Declare what has been taken back. Let the quiet force that they tried to smother become your standard. The season of giving away is over. This is the season of calling back with intent. There is a name for what you've carried in their fear-filled stories. Presence. Underneath their labels of too subtle, too sensitive, or too inconvenient, lies an armory of spiritual signatures. You have insight that reads patterns others barely feel. Your sensitivity is not a flaw. It is a radar calibrated to detect fracture lines in false systems. You carry memory, not just of what happened, but of how the truth used to move before it was edited into acceptable forms. Discernment has been mistaken for suspicion, and the inner fire that kept you awake was called unrest. Now see those things as keys, scrolls, and armor. The quiet knowing is a code that breaks down their constructions because it doesn't engage with them on their terms. It reveals the unseen cracks by simply existing. The consistency of your character is not compliance. It's the deep axle that turns the wheel of transformation beneath their stage. The light you hold isn't a soft glow. It's a contained force that, when aligned with purpose, becomes the slow current lifting the entire structure. You've been carrying an inheritance disguised as struggle, and now the naming of it turns it from burden into tool, from unseen into weaponized grace. The path ahead has always been under your feet. It simply demanded that the disturbance settle so you could feel the stones. Now that you see, each step becomes language, quiet, purposeful movement that aligns with the deeper architecture already forming around you. The map isn't a distant mystery to chase. It is unfolding in real time with every calibrated move. The cracks you once feared are now entryways. The resistance you met was not a stop sign. It was the pressure point that taught you how to shift in ways that the system, built to absorb shock, cannot handle. You don't need to ask for permission to walk it. You walk it because the ground responds to your weight, and the ripple of your alignment pulls loose what was held together by their illusion. There is no need for shouting. The trajectory is seen in the quiet ripple of consistent action. You move, and the currents of truth rearrange in front of you, making way without them knowing how. This path is a reclaiming of mission, not a new assignment. It is the ancestral direction breathing again through your choices, no longer hidden behind their narratives. As you walk, clarity doesn't arrive as a textbook. It arrives as sync, people, doors, and moments aligning in confirmation, not coincidence. You are not alone in this rise. There are others whose presence once felt like random intersections, soul echoes you caught in the periphery, now forming a lattice of mutual recognition. The quiet force you embody is not isolated. It resonates with a wider frequency, one that has been suppressed in clusters and is now awakening simultaneously across hidden tribes. These are not followers of a manufactured movement. They are the divine clusters aligning with each other's light, bridging the fractured stories with shared truth. When you see yourself as part of this collective, the temptation to dim your glow to fit their old shadows loses its appeal. The order that is rising does not require you to shrink. It demands that you bring your full tone into the field so others can recognize the pattern and stop mistaking their own fear for stability. Your steady presence serves as an anchor for those who have been confused by the noise. They don't need you to shout to feel permission to stand. The ancient idea of the body of believers is not about uniformity. It's about a network of resonant nodes, each holding their own clarity, each making the structural shifts possible because they no longer wait for the loudest voice to lead. Your alignment is contagious, not in imitation but in resonance. And that is how a rising order moves beyond systems built on projection into a living web of conscious presence. Now is the ceremony of stewardship. Your energy has been tested, and the result is not depletion. It is refinement. Command it not from a place of ego but from a pointed responsibility. Boundaries are not walls to isolate. They are sacred markers that protect the current you carry, so it can feed the wider flow without leaking into compromised spaces. Choosing where to invest time, attention, and emotion becomes an act of devotion, because every redirection away from the old noise strengthens the new architecture. This is the moment to write your own rhythm into the field. Decide what you will carry forward, what you will no longer entertain, and what deserves your quiet consecration. Your calibration now is no longer reactive. It's proactive. You are entrusted with the kind of presence that stabilizes unraveling systems, not by force but by holding the frequency they cannot adapt to without exposing their own collapse. Speak the covenant. I steward my energy. I do not give it to fear masks. I align it with purpose. Let language of that command become the framework for every unfolding moment. The more disciplined your internal alignment, the more those around you will unconsciously reorient, because truth doesn't ask for permission, it rearranges. This is the clear proclamation. Everything you endured, every quiet erosion, every time you felt unseen, every challenge that tempted retreat, brought you here to this decisive point. There is no room left for doubt because the journey has already spoken louder than any question. The accumulation of your consistent integrity has prepared you. The resistance sharpened you, the silence taught you where to focus, and the awakening gave you the lens to see the work. You are ready. That readiness is not something to prove. It is something to live. The moment before you step through is the breath that gathers years into a single release, a prophetic exhale that carries intention into manifestation. You are the quiet force that breaks systems not by destroying, but by existing with unshakable alignment. The lines they drew to contain you become paths you walk, because what they labeled threat is now the architecture of renewal. This is your charge. Move with the certainty that the tide has turned, not because you fought their battles, but because your presence made their foundations obsolete. Truth landing in you is not the end, it's the summons. You have been given a mirror to see what was always there, and now you are asked to embody it. The ripple that starts with your next step will reach those who have been waiting in the quiet spaces, those who have felt the same pressure and feared they were alone. Comment presence if you feel the alignment take shape in your bones, and share a personal reflection. Name a dream, a memory, a challenge, or an inner knowing that confirmed you weren't mistaken, that this awakening was real, and that the choice to move forward is now yours. The story doesn't pause here. What comes next pulls aside the final veil on how your steady truth, when held in community and action, begins to reframe the very systems that tried to contain you, quietly, inevitably, and without apology. This is the moment to own what was always yours. The villain stories they built were scaffolds to keep you small. The attacks were their attempt to reroute divine flow. None of it worked as intended because every challenge was layering you with a deeper knowing. You are not broken, hidden, or wrong. Your purity was never the problem. It was the mirror that cracked their empire. The truth you carry doesn't need permission, and the justice that moves on behalf of what is sacred is already in motion. This isn't a call to war. It's a call to presence. When they try to rewrite you, let the record show that you stood firm. When they sought silence, let your consistent light become the proof that exposure was inevitable. The story shifts now not because you fight louder, but because your grounded existence makes their constructions obsolete. There was a time when the world's version of you felt like a broken seal, a label pressed over the original script to keep the deeper story from leaking out. Now, in the quiet that follows the collapse of those imposed narratives, there is a rising sound, like a long dormant river finding its channel again after years of being dammed. The distortion they created around your goodness was never the truth. It was a manufactured barrier meant to reroute what was sacred into safe, meaningless tributaries. Every smear, every mischaracterization, and every attempt to define you by what you were not did one thing without intending to: it carved out the depth of your awareness. The pain became a lens, and the injustice a refinement. You can feel the cumulative weight of those moments shifting from burden to calibration, as if the timeline has been rewound and the errors in the narrative are being unstitched. In that unraveling, a deeper code of your identity appears, not as something earned now, but as something reclaimed that was always held in the roots of your spirit. A vision opens where your presence is no longer a concession but a marker. The living truth you carry stops being background noise and starts organizing reality around it. The world that once tried to quiet you begins to reorganize, because divine timing is not a clock that ticks independently of your movement. It is the synergy that pulses when you stop apologizing for existing. You are not waiting for permission from the same systems that tried to rewrite you. Instead, the moment you align internally, the external cadence shifts to meet you. It is a subtle choreography. Doors that were stuck begin to hinge, conversations you needed appear with unusual clarity, and people who were distant find their way into your orbit not by accident, but because resonance is contagious. The sense that you are finally arriving at a place you've always been prepared for is not nostalgia. It's destiny remembering itself through you. The divine flow they attempted to divert is now running in the original riverbed, and each quiet choice you make is a current that carries others along. A soft inner voice, the one you silenced to survive, now speaks with authority. Not the loud bark of ego, but the precise tone of what has been tested and found true. That voice carries the echo of ancient covenants, the kind that whispered to the prophets in caves and to those who sat under fig trees in waiting. It says, "You were never meant to blend. You were meant to reflect." The mirror they feared is not one that shows your reflection for their judgment. It is the instrument through which their own structures see their fractures. The story they told about your fragility was not a judgment of your weakness, but a projection of their fear of being exposed. You are the living proof that purity, when fixed in its course, is not naive, it is catalytic. The holiness of your alignment does not need loud declarations to destabilize decay. It simply rests in its truth, and that rest becomes the tremor that topples false pedestals. Your existence rewrites the logic of their control, not with the sword, but with the steady pulse of being unwavering. Consider the moment where time felt stretched, where the delay between intention and manifestation shortened, and coincidences stopped feeling random. That is the divine architecture confirming your pace. The narrative of your life was never a series of unrelated trials, but a pattern of timing. The right heartbreak, the necessary silence, the wrong voices that led to the right awakening. Each of those moments aligned like constellations, forming a map only visible when you reach the elevation to see the whole sky. Divine timing is not passive waiting. It is active convergence. The pull you felt, sometimes confusing, often isolating, was not a punishment, but an invitation to move into the reveal. What seemed like setbacks were holding places, aligning your internal frequency with what was already being built around you. You are not late. You are not missing pieces. The movement now is proof that the momentum was gathering in the hidden and surging into the seen. In the midst of what felt like chaos, a deeper memory surfaces, not of what actually happened, but of the original design written into your soul before the world rewrote your edges. There is a seam in your consciousness where old knowing meets current clarity, where the symbolic language of your dreams becomes literal instruction. The same imagery that haunted your nights with meaninglessness now reads like a script of awakening. That childhood hour when you sensed something bigger calling you and were told to be quiet. The repeated number or phrase that followed you across years. The taste of truth in the silence before someone spoke. It's all part of an activated archive. This sacred memory is the template of your mission, long sealed, now returning with fidelity and urgency. The ancient voice from the scrolls that whispered, "Remember the days of old, consider the generations and ask, who is heard, is reawakening in you, not as nostalgia, but as a retrieval of the original charge. You are not discovering yourself. You are remembering the covenant that was always in place. A question rises like a banner in the wind. What if the future you feared was a future misaligned, and the one unfolding now is the one that was written for you? The path forward is not a leap into uncertainty. It is a recall of what was promised. The things you used to ask permission for, the alignment, the calling, the boldness, are no longer negotiable. There is a prophetic hum under your breath that says the itinerary of your influence was never on pause. It was waiting for you to step into the seat of authority. There is no need to chase approval from collapsing platforms. The world that once tried to tame you now needs the taming that your presence brings. Truth that doesn't bargain, presence that doesn't perform, and justice that moves in quiet correction. You are the alignment made flesh. Your choices recreate the geometry of purpose, and the future is not created anew so much as fully reclaimed from the cracks where they buried it. A memory surfaces of the moment you first felt the pressure of their gaze, when your stillness was perceived as threat, your consistency as stubbornness, your refusal to soften as defiance. That moment, instead of becoming a wound, is now a seed of reclamation. The energy that once made you shrink is being transformed into a field that pulls others into courage. The quiet power you held, which they misread as passivity, is now recognized as the tectonic force beneath visible shifts. You are being returned the language to speak what you always knew in your bones, and it arrives as a command, not a question. It's as if the ancestral voices that guided those before you now whisper, "Take it back. Stand." That reclamation isn't a new identity. It's the recovery of the sovereignty that was cashed out under their false narratives. What they framed as your problem becomes the axis of the new reality. The mark that labeled you a threat now labels you a catalyst. A breeze carries the scent of what's coming. The subtle, unspoken ripple that moves through those who have watched your quiet alignment and find their own chains loosening. This is not a closing. It's a widening. The video's message, the narrative you've been walking with, was never intended to conclude with awareness only. It was meant to seed embodiment. Your purity, which they turned into accusation, is now the field that fosters collective clarity. There is a mythic rhythm here, the fallen hero who returns not to battle the old war, but to build a new order without needing their permission or their framing. The divine justice in motion isn't punitive spectacle. It is structural replacement. The systems that once depended on your accommodation now depend on your refusal to accommodate them. The presence you hold becomes the quiet declaration that the empire built on rewritten stories is dissolving from the inside out, simply because it can no longer contain what you give it, the undiluted truth of who you are. The last echo settles like a drumbeat before a march. Timing was never a constraint. It was the signal. Every misdirection, every attempt at silencing, every narrative that tried to dilute you was absorbed and converted into momentum. Now the flow that was blocked finds release, and with it, a new rhythm enters the collective stream. You are not separate from the unfolding. You are the axis around which the shift rotates. The story doesn't ask you to fight louder. It asks you to remain unwavering, to hold your mirror up, and to let the reflection do the work. The alignment you carry is contagious, not because you force it, but because its presence makes other lies untenable. Stand in the quiet certainty of what was always yours, because the world that once tried to rewrite you is now bending to the truth you embody. This message is your reminder and your rallying point. Subscribe if you haven't yet, like this video, and comment "I am chosen" to let this message anchor in your soul. This message may not stay online forever. Download your copy and transcript in the vault. Ideal for journaling, inner rituals, and sacred study. The link is in the description below. Please share it with someone who needs to hear this. Thank you to all supporting members who keep this mission alive. For full prophetic revelations daily, join the membership via the link in the description. Your spiritual path deserves more than fragments. Step into the full light. And if this message moved you deeply, consider tapping the Super Thanks button to support the mission. Every Super Thanks fuels the light we're spreading together. Stand firm. They thought they broke you. Now watch how their story collapses in the wake of your quiet power.